Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life is Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Comoon. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the St. Thomas the Apostle Church campus in West Springfield, Massachusetts. So, tell us about the history of the church itself.
Well, the church had a prior church to it, so the one you might see there now on Pine Street is not the original. The original sadly burned down in 1905. So the history of the church itself dates back much earlier than this one. It started in West Springfield in 1869 on Pine Street. And at that point, it was called a mission church of the Holy Name Church in Chicopee itself. That means it was one that depended upon the services of a pastor from a larger church in another community. There weren't enough Catholics in West Springfield in 1869, but there were a few, and so that's why they started a mission church. But through the years, it grew larger and larger, and that's great. It ended up being on its own only a few years later in 1877. And its first pastor, which is the head priest of a church, went by the name of William Phelan. And he was able to grow the church up to a fairly high level. What I've done for you is have a list of the pastors on my website so you can get to see on your own some of the history of the church. Now today we're going to consider also the history of the school itself with Associated Convent. We're also going to consider the history of the cemetery, and we're also going to consider what's around this whole area and how it fits in. Like a lot of churches, it becomes a nucleus for a community as far as Catholics are concerned. And it still is, and it still is an active church there with an active social center. Now, the church that is there now was built in 1906 at 63 Pine Street. And it's a Gothic revival church, which of course has pointed windows. And it developed very strongly from there, finally getting a school, a convent, but it always had a rectory since 1877 when William Phelan was around. And that rectory is still there. It has the look of a Victorian home. It has a carriage house behind it, so we'll talk about that at some point. But when you go towards this more modern church, you don't get the sense of what that very old church looked like. So at some point, I hope to include a picture of that old church for you directly on my webpage so you can see what it looked like.
And tell us about the Covenant and the school's history.
Okay, so it kept developing more Catholics inside of West Springfield, which mostly right from the beginning a Protestant community. And Catholics are ones that usually comes to where the mills are, and so when they developed a canal and a mill system close to this area, then you got the Catholics coming in. And at some point they had enough where you can get a school go for yourself. And finally the school came around, and of course when you get a school, you're going to need a convent too. So the first school and convent came around 1931, and they had their first school year then, and in 1932. And it kept going and going strongly from that point. And that's good. It's no longer actively with a convent, but it is active still with a school. So the nuns have gone away, but if you go behind Pine Street, you have a very large addition to the former school area, and they still have a kindergarten through 8th grade school in this area, which is wonderful to see.
And really quick, before we continue with our interview, just to fill our listeners in, for more information or to sign up for any of his various tours, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org, and there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, at yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun educational outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview. So tell us, Bob, the nearby cemetery also has a significant history as well. Is that right?
Yes, that cemetery, the St. Thomas the Apostle Cemetery on Kings Highway, is very large and many additions to it through the years. But you can walk from the front of the church and in about 1.5 minutes be into the old part of that very old St. Thomas Cemetery. Now in there are buried some of the old pastors. William Phelan is not buried, Patrick Phelan is not buried there. He's actually buried in the Calvary Cemetery in Holyoke. But one, James Terrell, is buried there. And he's important because he got the old time school going, and he got the old time church fixed after it burned in the fire. A year after he came here as a pastor, the church burns down, and you can imagine how much pressure he had on him to get money to build that new church for himself. But he did a great job, and he's buried off to the left front of that cemetery. So most Catholic cemeteries are far away from their churches, but in this case, it's fairly close in. And that's great. And I'm going to have my own podcast and videos and page just for that cemetery.
And describe the vicinity surrounding the church's campus for us.
Okay, I think the highlight is that rectory and its carriage house. The rectory is from 1877. It's a gorgeous building, still very active, and still occupied. Then around that area you have some Victorian homes, not only on Pine Street, but also on Kings Highway. So a lot of these came around 1880s, early 1890s. Now, if you walk a mere block away, you start to get into the low income kind of housing. So there are simple houses around the area too. And of course, the Catholics coming into work in the mills would have very low level housing. And a lot of it's still around. So it makes for an easy neighbor to understand and for a nice neighbor to walk around, especially for like old church environments and old Victorian homes. I like being in this neighborhood because of both the church and the modern school look to it and the old cemetery next to it. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Robert, for educating. Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life Was Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Kumu. He offers both public and private tours as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight on the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various park streets and selected historical houses within each community. And in today's episode, we will be discussing the St. Thomas Church and Cemetery, located in West Springfield, Massachusetts. So describe the St. Thomas Church campus.
The church campus itself is very close to the cemetery. And as you sweep through it, you will see all that you expect out of a Catholic church campus right there. And for that reason, it's an incredible look. And also the cemetery is very close at hand. It's right down the street. And so you have everything in very close quarters. So this is one of the few times where you can actually combine a church campus with a cemetery tour and in a meaningful way, that they are belong to one another. And that's very rare. I did it once for the St. Rose de Lima Church in Chicopee, But there was a half-mile walk. Here, after about 150 yards, you're at the cemetery. And today we're going to talk about the early history of this church, what it was like. And we're also going to talk about that cemetery. And we're also going to talk about the oldest burials in that cemetery. All right, so this is such that the church is right in front of you. It's a church from 1906. It replaces a church that was destroyed in the fire, nearly the same location. The rectory is, as you look into the church, the rectory is to the left-hand side, and that's at 47 Pine Street. All right, and then the rectory has a carriage house, and that's in the back. And then the school is now you start to look towards the right-hand side. The school is at 75 Pine Street, and it was made in 1961. And, of course, behind it, it's a very, very large school. And behind it, the school keeps going and going backwards. Now, to the right even of the school, there's another building. And that building was made a year after the school in 1962. And it's called the St. Thomas the Apostle Hall. And that was the former location of where the nuns had their convent. The first convent there was in 1931, but it was replaced by this one in 1962. And then once the nuns didn't teach at the school anymore, this whole building was turned into a hall, a social hall. Now, the situation is such that the first pastor was the first pastor in the mission church was someone that belong to the Holy Name of Jesus, which was in Chicopee, and he was Patrick Healy. I think he was like the fourth pastor of that church, and he served in the mission church for a very long time. And then when it finally became a church on its own right, separate from the other church that it depended upon, its first pastor and its founder was Patrick Phelan. Now, Patrick Phelan would stay here for only a short while, and then he'd move off to serve in the Sacred Heart Church of Holyoke after that. And so you had some other pastors come in, John O'Keefe, Thomas O'Keefe, John Griffin, and then came in James Terrell, and James Terrell served for over 20 years as the pastor of St. Thomas the Apostle Church. And he really got it stabilized, and that's always good to see.
And really quick before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, if you're interested in finding out more information or signing up for any of his various tours, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can also find videos and podcasts of the stops along each tour, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214B@yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, describe the St. Thomas Cemetery.
St. Thomas Cemetery is within about 150 yards of the church. It's a very large cemetery at this point, with a lot of milestones towards the back right. It's also with 4 Jewish cemeteries off to its right-hand side. In the middle, there's a small section where there's a tiny chapel. And the St. Thomas burials that are very old tend to be towards the front. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago that a very important pastor in the development of the St. Thomas Church was James Terrell, and he's buried in this cemetery, which is great because I like when at least one pastor, especially an important one, is buried in the parish's cemetery. And I'll read his stone to you, erected by the St. Thomas Parish in memory of Reverend James J. Terrell, pastor of the St. Thomas Church, December 7th, 1905 to October 22nd, 1925. Born February 24th, 1858, and died October 22nd, 1925. So he died as the pastor. He never had a chance to retire. But he was a very important pastor because after that fire, The first year we were there, he's still in the old parish church. But the next year, during that year, the church burned down. And so the next year, they had to build a new church. And he was instrumental in getting that church going. And also in getting the level of parishioners up to a very high level. And that church is very beautiful, both outside and inside. It has a nice, unique look to it. Now, the rest of the cemetery is a cemetery for 3 different ethnic groups: the Polish, the Irish, and the French Canadians. And some very old stones are towards the front. We're going to talk about those next.
And so, where are the oldest burials?
The oldest burials are right on front, a little bit towards the left. There's a mid-patch in that front. And as you walk across, you'll start to see a lot of very old stones. Now, the oldest burial in there, I found 2 cemetery stones from 1871. They're probably the oldest burials with stones. There might be a couple others earlier that year that were without stones. So, if you want to find those old ones, go to the mid-patch front and a bit towards the left of that patch. Across from that patch is the section where the Reverend that I just mentioned is buried. So it's got some old stones, and mostly as you go through it, you'll see a lot of modern stones in the cemetery.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And of course, we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And you can find out more podcasts on his website as well as on SoundCloud.com. And be sure to check out videos and podcasts posted daily. Thank you for joining us and tuning in.